This is what I've wanted my entire life. We're going to make an edit to the agenda here due to the fact that we don't quite have quorum yet. So the one voting item was the approval of minutes, and I'm going to hold that off in hopes that maybe somebody else shows up. So we'll hold off on that.
I'll go ahead and give you a roll call just so you got the
Great.
official tally.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, so let me do that in a minute so everybody can hear me as well. So, Feltman?
Here, present.
Christians?
Here.
Schultheis?
Present.
Engbers? Corbin? Pajot? Thompson? Williams?
Present.
4 out of 8, so we're one shy of quorum.
Thank you, Dave. All right, so the next item is public comment, and I'll just remind everybody that if you want to make public comment, you have 3 minutes, I believe. Is that correct? Is that 3?
Yeah.
3 minutes, and if you do come forward, we need you to state your name and the jurisdiction where you live.
Hello, I'm Deborah Williamson, and I'm a Holland resident. I live on 17th Street, and I want to talk to you about trees. And I want to commend the BPW for working with Arbor Day and giving away free trees. I think that's a great program. But I'm really concerned. We have a drought, and there's a lot of trees dying all over the city, especially the trees that have been recently planted. And I was told I was talking to people about the resurfacing of Van Raalte a year ago, that the city wants to plant short trees that flower. Well, when I look at these trees, they're really not going to provide an urban canopy. They're planted too far apart. They're not going to get to be great big trees. And all you have to do is walk through the historical district and then walk through Westcor, and you'll feel a big difference in temperature, because a sturdy tree canopy can reduce the temperature by 10 degrees. And you can feel it. I rode my bike over here, and I could feel it. So I encourage you to do that, and I encourage you to continue to plant trees closer together, trees that are going to get big, so that people who live here 100 years from now, when there's going to be a higher temperature because of climate change, we're not going to have people burning up in their houses and not able to come out. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Not seeing any, then I'm going to go ahead and close public comment. I'd like to jump back since Mr. Corbin has arrived, and we now, I believe, have quorum. Would like to approve the minutes. Does anybody have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Now that we have that, is there any discussion? Not hearing any, then I'm going to go ahead and, Dave, do you call the roll on that
You
too?
can do a voice vote for that. It's fine. Just call for all in favor.
Okay.
Yeah.
All in favor then of approving the minutes from the last meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstain? All right, motion passed. All right, now we are down to the number 4 on the agenda, and that is the electric portfolio background information.
Yeah, so there are 2 presentations this afternoon, and I'm going to hand it off to Joel for the first one, and then Joe Sikma for the second one. Again, we're setting the stage with background for the discussion next month, which we start getting into the levers, and specifically the electric portfolio lever, and review of the tactics and the goals associated with that. So foundationally, Joel, I'll turn it over to you for the first presentation then.
this first presentation is really foundational to the one that Joe's going to provide. What I'm going to walk through is just some of the recent changes to Michigan energy laws, just walk through what those really mean. And then Joe will talk through a little bit what that means for our portfolio going forward. So this first slide just kind of outlines the three different pieces of legislation I'm going to walk through, so kind of an agenda here, if you will. PA 235, which was the Clean and Energy Renewables Standards. PA 229, which is really energy waste reduction and beneficial electrification. And then PA 233, which has to do with siting approval of renewable resources. Probably the biggest one impacting our portfolio of resources is the Clean and Renewable Energy Standards. This just kind of highlights what those changes were, kind of putting in place new renewable energy standards and clean energy standards. So historically, we had a requirement of about 15%, or of 15%. It ramped up actually to 15%. That went away here a few years ago. It's now back, which you'll see through 2029. At that point in 2030, it jumps up to 50% of all energy needs to come from renewable resources, and then 60% in 2035 and beyond. That 2035 timeframe also corresponds to the start of the clean energy standard, where at that point we need to have 80% of our energy coming from clean energy sources, which includes renewables. The differentiation there is it also includes some additional resources. Pretty prescriptive. It's basically, it adds in nuclear, and then it adds in combined cycle natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. So where you're capturing the carbon from the stack and pumping it down underground. Then in 2040, it goes to 100%. So you'll just see that graphically there on the right. So I wanted to spend a moment kind of talking about how exactly that compliance works. As you can imagine, and kind of that image on the right kind of shows that, and probably a lot of you are familiar with this. The electrons that come from a generation site don't automatically go right to the end customer. They don't know match up exactly with what they may be purchasing. You know, if they're getting renewables, it all goes into the grid together, commingles. So the only way that you can really take credit for that renewable energy is through an energy attribute certificate. For renewables, it's a renewable energy certificate. So for every 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy that's generated, there's 1 REC that's generated. And those RECs are the means of compliance. So basically, when we're required to have 15% of our energy coming from renewable resources, what that really means is we need to retire renewable energy certificates equal to 15% of our sales. So just wanted to kind of point that out. There were some other changes that came about in the PA 235 legislation that weren't historically in there. So when we're calculating how many of these RECs we need to retire, it's also accounting for a few things first. So it's not just taking it right off of our retail sales, it's adjusting our retail sales for a few things first. One is a voluntary green pricing program. So that's our elective renewable rate, where customers may elect to go above the 15% threshold that we're using. Those actually come off when they calculate. Now we still retire 15% regardless. And then there is outflow from distributed generation resources. So if somebody has solar in their house and it's kicking out a little more than what they're using, and that goes out to the system, you can take that off and adjust the retail sales before this calculation. And then finally, a big one that I'll touch based on a little more at the next slide, is actually RECs retired by large customers. And there's a specific carve out for that that I'll talk a little more about. So these are provisions that are in the law specific to municipal electric providers. A couple important ones here when we get into the integrated resource plan that Joe's going to talk about. First and foremost, through 2035, municipal electric providers have the ability to use disassociated RECs. So these are, instead of buying a bundled product where you get the energy, capacity, and RECs all together, you can actually purchase just the RECs as a separate commodity and retire those. We have the ability to do that through 2035 for basically up to 100% of our need for those RECs. After 2035, they all have to come from, all the RECs have to come from resources where we have the energy, capacity, and RECs. So they have to be something that's within our portfolio. And those RECs that we can use, the disassociated RECs, can come from anywhere within your regional transmission organization. For us, you may have heard MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. That's the grid operator that we are a part of. You can kind of see that on the map, the area that opens us up for these RECs in that blue color, the light blue. And then the other kind of key one in here, and actually Dave was kind of instrumental in getting this in the legislation, because there was something in the legislation that allowed for the investor-owned utilities, some large customers, they had to be able to use RECs that those industries were retiring to meet their compliance. The legislators did add something in there that allows for the usage of RECs from a large customer, but that customer had to be existing at the time of enactment of the law of PA 235, and they have to represent at least 25% of our system's peak demand. That's an important one there. Kind of keep that in mind when we get into the integrated resource plan, because that kind of gets into how we achieve compliance. So this kind of gets to, again, how we're meeting it. One of the things that we have to do every 2 years is submit a renewable energy plan to the Michigan Public Service Commission. This plan just outlines how we intend to comply with that act. It's not anything that is committing you to exactly what you lay out in that plan, but it's your best guess at how it's going to work out. Obviously, you're looking at this going between now and this looks 25 years into the future. You're kind of taking your best guess at how you're going to meet that. That was attached to the agenda. We can bring it up if there's interest, but if not, I'd at least encourage you to look at it, because there's a couple key things that, again, go into what Joe was going to show. Because within that, you will see those two items on the last slide, those disassociated RECs and the customer-owned RECs are two things that, at the time of that filing that we did earlier this year, we were intending to use. And I'll get into some of the reasons why here in a moment. But just an important thing to keep in mind. And again, this will be something we update every 2 years. Clean energy standard, I kind of mentioned what that means. It really doesn't come into play until 2035. Well, kind of correspondingly, they haven't quite worked out exactly what that's going to look like yet for compliance, but the assumption is it will require a different type of environmental attribute certificate. RECs would probably be qualifying, but there will probably also be a separate attribute certificate for those clean resources, so the nuclear or the carbon capture, the natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. So something to come. Similar to the renewable side, the clean energy, we also have to submit a clean energy plan that will demonstrate how we intend to meet that. However, because they're still working through some of the rules around that, you'll see that first clean energy plan isn't due to be filed until 2028. So a little time before we get there, but then once that's filed, that has to be amended and refiled every 4 years. So this slide kind of walks through just some of the challenges with this legislation, and this isn't to critique the legislation. This is more to set it up a little bit so Joe can talk about how we're meeting some of these challenges. But I'll also talk a little bit about, there's some timing things here that could create some challenges in the future for utilities to comply, that could result in changes to the legislation in the future. and/or some extensions of timelines. One of the big things here from a timing standpoint, whenever you're going to build a new large generation unit, whether it's renewable or non-renewable, you have to interconnect to the grid. Part of that is you get in an application to MISO, you get in that queue. Just a reality here, that queue is a 5+ year wait today. So timing of developing some of these resources to meet the need here is going to be challenging. Just something to kind of point out there. Other things that are kind of a challenge really from an affordability standpoint, Joe will get into that a little bit with the IRP. Obviously, we've seen some recent things here with the build, or with the new bill that really wiped away the Inflation Reduction Act in 27, the incentives for renewables. I mean, to give a little frame of reference on what we're seeing, and it's not just that, there's also been more pressure on supply chain and on the labor market, just driving up costs of some of these renewables. So for frame of reference, large solar farms not that long ago, beginning of the pandemic, we were paying around $40 per megawatt hour. Today, it's low to mid 80s. And we've been told that with the loss of the Inflation Reduction Act, it's pretty much a straight increase of 30%. So you're now north of $100 per megawatt hour. Now that all could change because obviously those markets kind of evolve over time. But just again, to give you a little concept of where those things are, that creates a bit of a challenge there. Resource adequacy is another part of this. On the right, I liked this image. Some of you have probably heard the term duck curve before. This just kind of helps you to see it a little better. This is just as the more solar in particular comes in, you see that the generation needs throughout those hours when the solar is performing, it really decreases that. At some point, it becomes a challenge for grid stability if you get too low. Now, you can do some things to address that, and you're seeing that. This is really representative more of California. This is not us today, but just as a representation of where things can go. You know, now they start talking about using battery to, give the duck a tummy tuck to, help spread things
I
out.
mean, and that's happening in California, right? Like if you had plotted 25, it would be above 24.
Correct.
And the head of the duck would be cropped off a little bit as batteries have come.
Correct.
So
So that's the evolution you see as
Yeah.
things like storage roll in. But just something, there is some more challenges for operating. This is not a local utility thing. This is really one of those things for MISO in a lot of ways to address the balancing of the resources with the intermittency.
Yeah.
But we all are part of that with our resource selections to help that stability. So just wanted to touch base at least a little bit on some of those challenges. And I mentioned with some of those challenges, the legislature did envision this wouldn't be entirely smooth. I think when you look at the actual act, there is written into it these opportunities for extensions for utilities. The method of achieving the extensions is a little different, but kind of the reasonings are the same. It's going to be things related to concerns relative to the costs. If it's becoming a big burden, it's going to be concerns related to that reliability, the resource adequacy concerns. And resource adequacy, I guess I didn't really talk about that. When you look at an intermittent resource, if you're looking at a natural gas generator and it has an installed capacity of 200 megawatts, it's probably going to have an accredited capacity so each utility has to have enough capacity to meet their peak demand plus a reserve margin for kind of safety, because at some point you're going to have resources out within the overall grid. And each resource is accredited a certain amount of capacity. Those baseline resources, baseload resources, more like a Holland Energy Park. They're going to have an accredited capacity that's maybe 80 to 90% of the nameplate capacity. Whereas renewables, it's going to vary seasonally, but that could be single digits to as high as 40% or something like that for some seasons. But it's a little bit of to demonstrate resource adequacy, you can actually get into a situation where you have to have a lot more resources to get to that point, I guess is something, and that I think will show up as well in Joe's slides here. But I wanted to point out the time extension because they do have in here for those reasons. The renewable energy standard, in that case, we would, if like we ran into an issue, we'd have to petition actually the Public Service Commission for an extension. In the case of the clean energy, that's actually the local governing body that decides, but regardless, again, the reasoning's the same for those, just again, kind of outlining what's in there. Now moving on to the energy waste reductions. So this is that PA 229. Again, we previously had the energy waste reduction mandate. Those had gone away, came back again with this legislation with a little bit of an increase here. So starting in 2026, we have a 1.5% mandate. Basically, we have to have at least that savings from one year to the next, with a goal of 2%. So you have to have that kind of reduction. And then the average life of any project that's incentivized has to be at least 8 years. There was some changes with this that can actually account more for beneficial electrification, which is something we've been working with, that'll actually allows you to get some credit for beneficial electrification, which is nice, which allows obviously with some help with some of the other levers here. I didn't hit it on the last slide, but I'll hit on it here. Probably the biggest challenges the BPW faces with this, and the first one really applies to everybody. There's less low-hanging fruit when you've had these programs going for a while. Lighting obviously has been the big one for these programs, and after a lot of years, a lot of the commercial industrial facilities have taken care of lighting, so you got to come up with new ideas, and that's obviously what Andrew and his group do well. One that's kind of interesting in here is they did write a requirement that 25% of the funds collected are to go to EWR for low-income residential. The graph on the right is just to kind of demonstrate, when you look at, we're at like 82% of our electric sales are commercial and industrial. And that residential, once you actually go to the low income, now you're taking only a sliver of that. It's going to be an interesting challenge to manage that 25% within that limited pool.
So that, I guess, to ask a clarifying question, the 25% is for the entire spend out of the EWR program,
Correct.
Not for
No, it's
the
not just residential
spend. Okay.
Yes, it is the entire program. So
Okay. Thanks.
we did seek clarification on that. And I'm sure we'll be talking about this a little more, the EWR, as we get into some of the other levers. And then this one's just another one of, this was the state's attempt to address one of the challenges. This is, they put in place an act looking at siting of large-scale renewables, and you'll see on there kind of the sizes that we're talking about. We're really talking about 50 megawatt and up, kind of depending on the resource. So what it really does is provides an ability for the state to handle the site plan approval, the zoning approval basically of these large projects, if the community does not have an ordinance that is compliant with the state requirements. And there's some other things there, if like the community changed something from their ordinance as things went along or didn't approve it fast enough. It just basically provides another venue for developers to go through. Now, it's an interesting concept, and this is one that the state has kind of followed Wisconsin. Wisconsin originally did this. I will say there's several challenges with this too. First and foremost, it's probably not going to create the best relationship with the community you're looking to locate in and the residents. That's one thing. From a timing standpoint, it's intended to help expedite things, but you have to still go, these utilities still, or developers have to still go to the local community first before they can go to the state, so it actually can add an extra layer on. There's lawsuits pending. I don't even recall the number of communities that it's up to now that have challenged the state on this. Last I knew it was in the 90s. I don't know if Keith, you know. The Public Service Commission's website, just to see how much people are utilizing this, and as near as I can tell, there's only issues with getting new resources online. So it provides a little bit of flexibility by having that banking system where you can kind of spread it out a little bit. It makes those, I'll say, timelines a little fuzzy on the renewable energy standard, but there's limits on what you can do with banking. So it's, but just
very specifically, we just created a deal where
Absolutely.
we're going to be getting another 15% roughly, maybe just a little shy of 15%, but 150,000 RECs every year. And we'll probably not retire a lot of those because they're in that 5-year window of 2030's big ramp up to the 50. So we'll be able to use that as a way of kind of gliding into this requirement in 2030 to be at 50%. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The second part is for the clean energy standard, recognizing that it's not in place yet, right? It's 2035, 80%.
correct.
If we applied that today, where would we stand as a percentage? Just trying to figure out what our next 10-year ramp is.
As today, it would really only be what we have for renewables. So we don't have anything that would qualify outside of the renewables, so it'd be,
Right now, we're 1 for 1.
Yes.
For renewables and clean
Yes.
energy.
yes.
Yeah, I like to say, like every renewable source is a clean energy source, but not every clean energy source is renewable. So,
Correct.
So it's kind of like the renewable, not renewable, not renewable, not renewable, not renewable, include renewable, include new and carbon capture and sequestering underground. You can't use inspiration to try to get additional removal of hydrocarbons out of the ground. It has to be permanently sequestered under the state's law for that to be considered clean energy.
So further complicate things. You can also get kind of bonus RECs for other reasons. So for example, if you put in energy storage and you're basically you're charging that with renewable energy during on-peak hours and then discharging it, charging during off-peak hours, discharging during on-peak hours, but you're using renewable energy basically to fill it, and there's no clarification on exactly what that really means. Does it have to be paired directly with it, or can it be, two separate locations? Then for basically every megawatt hour that you charge that energy system with, you get 1/5 of a REC. It's
You got good actuaries, I'm sure.
yeah,
I was gonna say,
it gets very interesting very fast.
Yeah.
one more question over here too. Trying to think through a scenario in the future. So let's say you're buying 150,000 racks, you got them in the bank, new renewable sources come online. Is there any financial or other compelling reasons that you want to trade out of those racks, or can we hold them for our own strategic energy plan metric management?
So recall that a disassociated REC is available to municipals, or frankly to other entities that aren't in Michigan. Because of Michigan's rule, you might be able to find a situation where you could sell those to others. That's why
Yes.
going too far in right now might be problematic, because if you're over complying,
Yeah.
And financially, oh, sorry, there it goes. You do want to get out of that position. You know, you could have a situation where you don't have anybody to sell to now because everybody else in the compliance can't use disassociated RECs. And so that's one of the issues too in terms of legislation, where you have to think about
Yeah.
how you're positioning and where these RECs actually came from.
So the rec market is becoming less deep and active over time, so your assets getting less liquid.
Yeah, because you are having to, most entities, municipals put aside because of, again, the scale of us is a little bit more difficult to manage our decision-making to say we want to build a 200 megawatt solar array. We have to depend on other developers or other larger entities to build it so we could participate in it. So that's why they gave us that flexibility, right? And so for others, they don't have as much of that flexibility. So it does sort of shrink
Yeah.
the pool of potential participants from just a buy-sell of the disassociated attribute. Yep.
So one of our initial, or our still is primary goal, you know, to provide reliable, reasonably, you know, priced energy. If are we or can we put ourselves in a situation where there's a meaningful impact if you're stuck with these racks for a longer period of time than you want?
Well, they'll expire. So that basically
Eventually.
becomes a lost investment then at that point. If you have, and you will just go ahead and you want to retire them because you want to take
Is
some
this
credit for them.
material insignificant?
It's not insignificant. Matter of fact, the deal that we made is about $4 a rec, so it's about, I think, $600,000 a year that we're spending on recs. But when we did some evaluation today, like Joel said, with $85 or more power costs for a solar array, we started taking the different attributes, and he mentioned energy, capacity, and the rec are kind of the three things that you can get from a renewable resource. And then we look at the market value that's projected for those first two.
Yeah.
You could sort of back those out of the contract price and say, well, what is the implied value then of the attribute for the renewable energy? It was more cost effective for us to buy it. Now, where did we get it? We got it from out of state, but within MISO. And so there may be another state where you have hydroelectric, for example, and that state doesn't have a renewable energy standard, isn't foreseen to have its own renewable energy standard. Well, that resource still has value, you know, from an ability to create a qualifying certificate. And so that's why they might price it as being, okay, we know that this isn't necessarily reflective of what a bundled value would be, but we also know that in our state, we can't get this. So again, that's opened up a little bit of an opportunity for us in the short run, but also we want to get over this hump a little bit from an affordability standpoint and let some significant efforts happen from a development standpoint. We have some supply chain issues, as Joel mentioned. Labor is another very major thing in terms of the build out of some of these larger farms. And so if the market matures and there gets to be more assurance of the trajectory of this law and what the impacts are going to be, you'll see the supply start to come in to support that. The good news is our flexibility creates an opportunity for us in the short run that then we can have a little bit more cost-effective way of meeting compliance, and then roll into something as that market matures,
Yeah.
you know, nearer to 2035.
Okay.
Yeah, to build a little on what Dave's saying, those non-municipal entities, they can only use 5%, they can go up to 5% of their renewable demand with these disassociated RECs. So again, they don't have that same
Yeah.
ability, but that also means they're gonna have a lot more need for this build out a lot sooner, which does give us the flexibility, like Dave said, to sit there, to take a little bit of time and wait for that to mature.
Sure.
And hopefully take some of the pressure off that labor and supply chain.
And I'll just say additionally, you're getting the sense of the complexity here. You're seeing a team at the BPW that's actively managing that, understands what our community energy plan goals are, but also taking a look at legislation that impacts us, but impacts us at different points in the future. And certainly a lot of commentary about if that legislation also will continue to change or recognize potential challenges in that legislation. And so figuring out the right path and kind of hedging what are the best commitments in there. I think staff is doing a really good job of ramping for and preparing and yet not overcommitting.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, because I think what's going to happen here, you're going to get a lot of this question about what is the impact from, you know, Joe's presentation coming up. So if you maybe if you have specific questions about the law and, you know, clarification on that, we could probably answer more of that. But you may get a lot of your answers around, okay, what's our path forward then with all this in mind, and how do we manage that? Probably in the next piece, which is the integrated resource plan presentation.
Scott?
Yeah, so this is a complex issue, so bear with me as I ask these questions, because I'm not even sure I know how to ask them correctly. So first was a comment, more importantly. I guess what I'm hearing is we have to use some or exercise some caution as we buy these RECs, because we don't know what the law will be in a few years. It could just reverse, and all of a sudden we don't. That doesn't mean we can't still buy them, and that doesn't still mean we can't reduce our carbon footprint, but it may not be, we may not have the pressure of the legislation against us. And also, if we purchase things too far in advance and bank too much, the value of those could drop significantly too. So, I mean, that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think that's true as it relates to the compliance with the energy law. The other piece of it, though, again, and again, we'll review with the IRP, is that we're looking at two different scenarios under the IRP you're going to cover. One is the decarbonization path for our portfolio in alignment with the goals and objectives within the community energy plan too. So it's not a lost cause. I mean, buying these RECs, even if something changes in the legislation, as we retire those, the value of that from a decarbonization of your portfolio still exists. And so you still get the ability to claim that as an offsetting number against the impact of running various fossil fuel generators. So that could still help meet that glide path within the community energy plan's goals and objectives as well. So, but you're right. I mean, some caution is warranted given the fact that things could change.
And I know certain segments of our population might get upset about me even suggesting that might change. I get that. Some others might cringe on this next question I have about strategically. What is there? I know we have a way in which we can volunteer when we're purchasing our electric. We can click on a button and voluntarily apply a certain percentage to RECs, correct?
Yeah, that's that voluntary pricing schedule. You can talk about
any opportunity for those who are interested. Again, I'm just spitballing here, right? So please don't think that I'm know the answer to this or should suggest that we do it right away. But is there a way in which individuals or companies, corporations can purchase RECs, the entire amount of RECs it would take to offset their entire footprint, in a way that it's voluntary and they can do that?
The answer is yes, and that is actually a program we're continuing to modify. So this past year, we actually kind of overhauled that program, put in place. One of the challenges we face a little bit is pricing that REC program right to make sure that it covers all the costs. So we put in place actually a hedging program so that we're buying RECs for that, so we can assure a price for our customers so that it's not dramatically changing, volatile. One of the other things we're now looking to add is more optionality on what they can select. So right now, anybody that's participating, and I should say, when we started that it was a 1.5 cent per kilowatt hour to buy that renewable energy. We're now down under 0.5 cent per kilowatt hour because of some of those changes. One of the things I was going to say, though, we're looking at adding optionality because as we talk to some of our industrial customers in particular, which is it's a net.
Those type of resources will be given some type of accreditation, whether it's like the renewable energy, whether it's incentivized differently, I don't know, but it will be.
Is qualifying and
So
can
the
we track RECs better are the two questions I had.
The legislation specifically states, again, if you have it had to be a customer existing at the time that the Public Act was enacted, and that represents at least 25% of your demand, your peak demand, then you can use their recs if they agree. So you also have to have something from them,
Oh.
like a affidavit or something, basically agreeing that they're retired
Just to cut,
that way.
just to cut to the chase, that's LG.
Yes.
You know, we just speak plainly about it.
Ah.
As Joel said, I worked hard to try to get something in the legislation because we knew that from a concentration risks perspective, you know, we needed some flexibility in that law to allow us to use recs that they might obtain, as opposed to making very large investments that if something happened to that load, we could have a stranded asset. And so this was a provision that was put in because Hemlock Semiconductor, for example, sits in Consumers Energy System at around 10% of their demand in total. And they have that provision carved out in the law, so we tried to get some sort of equal treatment there. We didn't get quite as good of a treatment, I would say, as some of the others got. But, you know, it gives us that ability to create some pathways towards compliance that we otherwise wouldn't have. And so that's very specific to that particular customer. If other customers are doing it right now, that's great. But again, the law only allows us to use customer-owned recs if they are in that qualifying category of being more than 25% of our
So
peak
going
demand.
out to try to gather and
Yeah.
measure like we were talking about last
But
time.
if they can use our voluntary green pricing program,
Got it.
then that comes into play again.
I got it.
Yep.
And again, Joe will touch base a little more on that LG issue and what that means,
Sure.
whether or not they hit that 25%. If they do hit the 25%, we do already have that in place as far as the agreement to use those for compliance.
Yeah.
So it's really just a matter of where their demand gets to.
Yeah. It's a big change that, you know, we were talking, gather the data and all that, and it's off the table. I get it.
From a compliance
Unless you're from compliance. Yeah. Not that it's still not a good thing, but
Yep.
I get it.
Yeah, because the community energy plan goals still have that as a viable lever. You know, if something would change in the legislation, that still is a worthy task and certainly worthy to try to encourage, you know, that to also happen for companies that are on their own decarbonization path.
One of the issues is there wasn't like a clearinghouse or an ability where transactions are being vetted in a
Right,
centralized
but now,
way, right?
again, as we pointed out, progress since 2021, we have this community level clearinghouse that ODC Network helped create, where that can occur.
Yeah.
Where beneficial project funding can be created by companies willing to essentially put their money towards an offset
To a
of
centralized
their impact.
clearinghouse. Get confidence and vetting and
Yeah.
and measurable.
So when we get to that lever, we'll talk in
Okay.
much more detail about
Thank
that
you,
one.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I believe there's, the next item on here is the Holland Energy Plan. Is that not anything we need to cover? There's two.
No, the
links.
renewable energy
That
plan,
was
Joel
all
just
part
wanted
of
to
it?
make sure you knew that was in the docket in
Got
case
it.
you needed to reference it, but otherwise, yeah, we're ready to move on to the IRP
Okay,
if you're
we've
okay.
built up all these expectations for Joe now in his presentation piece, so if you don't wow us, Joe, there's gonna be trouble.
Everything will be answered now.
I will give it my best shot. Yeah, thank you for all the great questions. These are the kind of questions, amongst many others, that we like to ask ourselves as we go through this integrated resource planning process. This is something that we do periodically. It's really the formal way that we look into the crystal ball and try to see all of our futures at any given time. There's a definition on this slide. It's pretty verbose, comes from the consultant that we went with to help do this process. But ultimately, the integrated resource planning process is looking at our portfolio, the assets and tools that we have, trying to optimize those in the long term over a 25-year period to make sure that we're hitting that reliability, affordability, and sustainability goals that we have set for ourselves or have been set for us, in this case by the state. As we go through that, really the backbone of an IRP is training up a model or feeding a model to help it kick out those strategies that we want to use to meet these potential futures. That bottom graphic kind of walks through what that looks like, where we're setting the rules and expectations, telling the model what we have and how we operate. Next, moving forward, telling it what we're willing to add, what are those potential portfolio additions we'd look at in the next 20 to 25 years. We then try to build what that environment could look like in the future. That's the wider market, whether that's the state or MISO that we're trying to operate within. And then it gives us those strategies. The computer kicks out these numbers, these potential asset additions, and we try to interpret those and understand what does that look like in the real world, how do we make a strategy from this going forward. I mentioned we do this periodically, and this really goes hand in hand with the community energy plan and this SDT process that we're going through again. We know this kicked off in 2011 with the CEP, Our most recent integrated resource plan before the one we're talking about today was in 2019. That one was really focused on the closure of JDY and the launch of HEP, understanding how that impacted our portfolio and making a strategy then. Many of the folks here were part of the 2021 SDT that came after that with some of the data coming out of the 2019 IRP, how that changed our emissions. You folks reviewed and revised some of those targets and strategies for us. So in this most recent IRP in 2024, we were trying to say, how do we adjust and make sure we're hitting those targets that were looked at in 2021? Bounces back and forth. There'll be a new SDT from you folks this year. We'll revisit again in 3 or 4 years. We think IRPs will become more frequent in the future as we continue to try to adapt and stay on top of things with all these changes. But it's a frequent periodic process that we go through, and it works well with the CEP. Going to talk through what's unique about this IRP that we went through and kind of how we set it up before we get into some results and what we're doing with them. We've teed this up well already. The first thing we did was set up 2 scenarios that we wanted our consultant and our model to look at. The first was trying to understand just what does it take for us to meet those goals that we talked about in 2021, that emissions target, a per capita emissions target that we were looking at by 2030. So trying to meet that with the model. The graph that you see here should look familiar in trajectory, but the units on it are a little bit different. That's looking at just what does the utility need to do in its part to help meet that broader goal of the community. So it's looking at emissions per megawatt hour, not the total emissions per capita, that wider community goal. So that was the first trajectory we wanted to look at. The second was with this state legislation that Joel just talked about, what does it take to meet both the CEP and these new renewable and clean energy standards that we're now trying to be in compliance with. That really sets the high water mark, but the model is trying to meet both in scenario B, the CEP and that state legislation. On top of those 2 scenarios, we wanted to look at a couple different sensitivities, we call them. These are possible changes to the parameters and how we set things up based on things that could happen in the future. So we'll walk through these and we'll see in the results how those influence the strategies that we might implement. The first one is a big one that we were just talking about, looking at how much LG grows, with that being our biggest potential for load growth in the next decade here in town. LG provided us with a forecast early on in this IRP process, late 2023, of where they thought they might grow in the next 10 years. We took that and tried to say, what happens if they hit different amounts of that growth that they're projecting? You might ask, why is 100% not one of the sensitivities? What they thought in 2023 has changed over time as market conditions have changed, some different news pieces have come out. It seems more likely that that 40, 60, or 80% is a more likely future. Of the forecast they provided us, they're high enough that they meet that little allowance in the legislation. We can use their RECs. We can apply what they're already purchasing to our own compliance needs. At 40%, they fall just short of that requirement, and we can't count their RECs and need to go by our own RECs on top of what they're getting to make sure we're in compliance. So that's a key piece that changes what we need to add to the portfolio. For the rest of the sensitivities, 60% is kind of that middle of the road that we use, so that's the background assumption for the LG forecast. The next piece we looked at is a little bit intuitive in the naming. It's a self-build sensitivity. Functionally, what we want to do here is understand what would happen if either because of markets in town that BPW owns. So instead of being able to take part of a larger new natural gas combined cycle facility or new nuclear or some larger thermal capacity, we could only do things that we could build and feasibly own here in town within our system. We did allow in that scenario the computer could still look and choose PPAs for wind and solar out in the market. One of the pieces behind that being if we were going to build all the wind and solar we need in town, there wouldn't be enough room for it. So that's not really a feasible, viable future for it. So it could still look to the market wider on the grid for wind and solar. That was self-built in the model. There was this weird thing called tariffs that was getting discussed, so we said let's put just a blanket 20% tariff accurate of what we experience. Another one to call your attention to is there's a little bit of purple in there. That is new generation coming from natural gas combined cycle. That's just additional capacity and some energy coming from another resource we need, particularly here with that 60% LG load case. There's growth that we need to match with new thermal resources there. Scenario A, just community energy plan. We'll jump forward now to scenario B. So this is CEP with that state legislation that Joel just outlined. And we're looking at changes that are happening in the colors there. You can see orange is still a big piece of it. HEP is still running, but less so in those out years when we hit 2035 and 2040, where we need clean energy making up the bulk of the production. And it has to be a zero emissions resource. Still here, you're seeing that there is some orange. That's that nuance we talked about. If we're able to account for LG's RECs in that 60% scenario, we can run HEP in compliance world behind those RECs that we're getting from LG. So HEP is still a pretty important resource from a generation side of the equation. Blue and yellow, there's more. The state's asking for a higher watermark for us in terms of renewables compared to the CEP. And then one more piece here. We saw purple in the last slide in that little middle piece. Here you're seeing pink. It's still natural gas combined cycle, but in this case, again, because we have that clean energy standard, it's going from an emitting resource with just typical natural gas to natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. So it's that added piece to make sure it's still compliant with that new state requirement. Any questions there? I'll flip back and forth just so you can catch the change on that one. So the next change is looking scenario B, what happens if we back LG's load down to that 40% case where we can no longer use their RECs? Here we see a pretty drastic change, particularly at that 2035, 2040 period, where HEP standard, but then we're using a lot more of that light pink natural gas combined cycle with carbon capture and sequestration to help hit the clean energy standard and the targets there.
Two quick points on this. So why would you have a unit that produces such a little amount but has staffing requirements and a lot of fixed costs? This graph is showing the outcome of an evaluation where you're trying to meet both the energy requirements and also, as Joel mentioned, this term resource adequacy. You have a plant built, it has capacity to run and capacity to make electricity, and so it satisfies that. Even if it doesn't run that often, it still satisfies it. But the other piece of that is, and important to the community, is that if you look at that amount of generation there, that is not sufficient for wintertime operation to run the waste heat for the snowmelt system either. So I mean, that's going to be a consideration when you think about if we were having to run under that kind of path, there'd have to be some other solution for the snowmelt system as a result of that generation profile. Whereas under the 60% case and running under the RECs that would be afforded by the customer-owned RECs, that gives enough flexibility in there to run substantial amount of time in winter for that basis. Just a fact on it.
Thanks, Dave. So we've got a little bit of a grasp for CEP versus CEP with this new state legislation. We're going to dive now into a little deeper look at what these sensitivities look like with an admittedly harder chart to read, so hang with me. These tables are showing the capacity additions that we need. So these are the building blocks that model is selecting to help produce that previous graph that we saw. It's looking at them for scenario A and scenario B with the different sensitivities applied on top of them. So I'm gonna hit the highlight reels. If you wanna dive into this and follow up with questions, we're happy to answer those, but there's a lot to pull here, so we try to just give the kind of the top headlines. So we're looking at LG's load growth, whether it's high or low compared to what we were anticipating. In the CEP only scenario, we see as LG grows, the model likes to add more natural gas combined cycle and more solar. And as LG grows, it likes to add less wind. Inversely, if there's a situation where LG is at that 40% mark, it leans more heavily onto wind and less on natural gas combined cycle and more onto solar. Not too crazy there. The scenario B side is where it gets more interesting, again, with this allowance in the state legislation for LG's RECs. If they are at 40% and we can't count for their RECs, That's that picture where we can't run HEP as much. We need a new natural gas combined cycle with carbon capture and sequestration. So we're bringing a new asset in to be able to cover that. On top of that, it likes to bring in more wind because we need RECs to help cover that same need. If LG grows a lot, we can run HEP, but there's also much more need for that to serve that load from that additional growth. So on that scenario and sensitivity, we see additional thermal generation that's in the form of new natural gas combined cycle and or peakers on top of some solar to meet the renewable that we need to match that higher growth scenario. Next sensitivity is looking at self-build. Again, this is switching just the resources that we could feasibly build and own ourselves here in town, except for solar and wind. On the scenario A side, again, nothing too wild here with just the CEP situation. Here, if we're doing just self-build, we see where we're doing new peaking in 2028 as opposed to taking a piece of a larger natural gas combined cycle facility somewhere out on the grid. This is just an apples for apples swap where it needs that characteristic, but it can't take it from somewhere in the market, so we use a different technology that's cheaper and easier to build in town. Similar installations of solar and wind, again, it can use the same tools to meet that renewables need. Scenario B, where we are looking at the state legislation, in this one, because it can't go get natural gas combined cycle from the market, it's just replacing that with additional solar early on. Similarly, in the long run, it can't go get new natural gas combined cycle with that carbon capture and sequestration. That's a large plant that we wouldn't build in town in addition to what we already have. It's just replacing that with a ton of wind and solar. This is where we went on an interesting rabbit trail and said, well, what if we just added carbon capture and sequestration to HEP if we do a retrofit on that asset here in town? It's a long process. The short story is it would be too expensive compared to doing more wind and solar in this sensitivity. If you have more questions about that, we can dive into it. There's a lot of intricacies to that assumption. Next sensitivity, no IRA. So we're living in an environment now where there's this sunset and you can potentially capture some of those credits for a short period of time here. This is modeling that those are not an option at all for any new additional resources and has 20% tariffs tacked onto it. When we're just looking at the community energy plan, we see less solar used overall to meet those needs, and wind drops out entirely. To replace that and keep us on the right track, serving load and lowering our emissions, we see that new carbon capture on a natural gas combined cycle facility that we would get somewhere out in the grid. Scenario B, this is looking at state legislation. Similar story where that solar and wind is back down. Solar is earlier and less overall. Wind is there as opposed to just CEP, but that's backed off as well. And again, we're looking to that natural gas combined cycle with carbon capture and sequestration. So what's it all gonna cost? What are the real implications to how this actually gets put in play? A lot happening in this slide as well. The top and bottom tables represent the same trends, just in different units. So I'll move through circles on the bottom, but you can read it however you prefer. That expressed versus dollars per megawatt hour or just total cost. This is net present value. So the first thing I want to look at is just what is the cost implication of the community energy plan versus trying to meet the state legislation on top of this. At the 60% LG load, kind of our base scenario, we see there is a cost increase here. That's a 8% increase to the NPV. That's not nothing. That's certainly something that's going to be hard to swallow. But it gets more significant as we look at other sensitivities on top of that. Next, we're looking at what happens if we're trying to meet the state legislation, but then we can't use LG's RECs, which is this big piece we've been talking about. So if we have to build that new natural gas combined cycle with carbon capture and sequestration and go acquire more RECs to be able to compensate for what they would already be doing, that drives up the cost significantly. So that went from 8% to a 30% NPV increase. A little less gloomy news here in the middle of some other headlines. The self-build doesn't look too bad. On the community energy plan side of things, it's marginally more expensive at about 4%. And then when we're trying to meet the state legislation, interestingly, the computer model kicked it out almost the exact same. So it's not significantly more expensive if we're trying to meet those things by doing self-build in town. That was back. And then the last sensitivity we looked at was that no IRA scenario. At 60% Again, here we're seeing a pretty significant cost increase, whether it's for the CEP or the state legislation. Losing those incentives is going to hurt. The CEP, it's an 11% increase on NPV. When we're trying to do state legislation, it's even worse at 20%. So that's another significant impact to the cost.
And I think the key there too is that, again, reminder that other than the one column, every other one of those allows for the customer-owned RECs to be used. It's the 60% case or higher in all those other ones. So if the IRA went away, is going away, tariffs, and then it's a 40% case, you can see, you really start to see a delta there because, again, you know, with 11%, you know, impact on the CEP case, but a 20% on the state case, that's compounded on the difference that exists between scenario A and B on that 40% column where it already is a 30% increase. So that may be closer to the future that we're sort of heading down, looking at the demand for EV growth and kind of where we're seeing the load forecast projections for LG relative to the state legislation. So it's not a given that we're going to be above that 40% level of what LG had indicated early on their load growth was going to be, or their load needs were going to be.
And then moving on, this was that little side study we did on battery energy storage systems. We looked at this in the short term and the long term, again, trying to understand at its current price, and if it gets cheaper or significantly cheaper at a 25 and a 50% cost reduction, is there times where the model would swap that in versus some of the other resources that we looked at for the characteristics that it can provide? So on the chart here, you're seeing, it was interesting, by 2028, even at the current pricing that we saw while we were running the model, if we're trying to meet that state energy legislation, siting a battery in town could make sense. As it gets cheaper, and we assume it will with that technology maturing over time, 25% cost reduction adds more under the state situation, the state legislation. And then if it gets significantly cheaper, half the cost that we had modeled, we see it being added community energy plan, state legislation, internal, and even potentially external. It becomes more and more valuable to us. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on. Similar trend here, just jump into 2040. Similar results, just as time goes on, we see an increased desire to add batteries by the model. So coming out of that, we kind of concluded some recommended near-term actions. Again, we're looking at a long time horizon. We're trying to set ourselves up for plays that make sense under multiple different scenarios and sensitivities. The first one we have listed here was to pursue some additional thermal, kind of that base load resource that we had talked about. So whether that's new natural gas combined cycle with carbon capture and sequestration, or a peaking unit, we see a need for that across many of the different outcomes. Timing on that as early as 2028 and by 2035 at the latest. Kind of a no-brainer based off the legislation update we heard from Joel. Solar and wind are things we're going to need to add here pretty soon. Looking at that by 2028, 2030 at the latest. We talked about when you want to put something in, you can't just plug it in tomorrow. You have to get in the queue. So 2028 is sooner than it feels. And on top of that, we just looked at the best resources that looks like it's a viable option, particularly when we're assuming state legislation sticks around, and even at the current pricing, that's something we want to keep an eye on. So what we're doing with that, currently trying to evaluate all of those and make steps forward coming out of this IRP process. That initial action item I talked about with the new natural gas resource is currently an action item with our joint action agency. So Michigan Public Power Agency is where BPW and the other municipals meet to work together. They're currently trying to figure out, can we locate one of these resources in one of the members' territories and then share those benefits across the membership. So that's an active process that we're participating in. On the solar side of things, we've kicked off internally a tactical action over this next fiscal year where we're trying to understand what would it look like, what would it cost us, where would it go to add solar in or around the BPW service territory. So that's something we should have a better grip on in the next year. Wind is a little tougher right now. It looks great on paper. The computer model really liked it. Joel talked about some of the siting issues. Wind faces some of the biggest challenges right now in terms of community pushback. The current administration is not favorable to wind. That's something that we're monitoring, but are less likely to see opportunities, at least in the near term. And then the battery storage systems is also something that we're looking at in that same tactical action item, trying to figure out, that little study said it makes sense to put that somewhere in town, so that's something being added to what we're looking at in the next year to see, does that cost what we thought based on the model? Where would that go? What would the implications be for us?
And again, these actions are complementary to and additive to things like buying the disassociated RECs that we mentioned earlier, and also some other utility scale installations of solar that have been added between the time you met last and where we are today. I think when we reviewed kind of what has happened, what accomplishments have we had. So our portfolio has also shifted a little bit, in that last 3 years, and then with the decision on the disassociated RECs, these steps here are really additive to that.
Also, just wanted to touch on a short list, items that we thought might be interesting but aren't really on that immediate action items. We talked about that retrofit of Holland Energy Park. Again, this is something that we modeled with the software and looked at with the consultant through this process. It was not picked across any of the scenarios or sensitivities. It wasn't economic compared to a new carbon capture and sequestration facility or other strategies to meet those same requirements. At the same time, going through that process taught us that those assumptions, if they change even just a little bit, could make it potentially cost competitive in the future. So this is something, when we revisit the IRP in 3 or 4 years, we'll definitely want to look at again. If we sense that the technology is advancing or feel like one of those assumptions has changed drastically, it makes sense for us to look at this and see if it's a more viable strategy. Talked about nuclear. Small modular reactors are kind of one of the big highlight items for that right now. Similarly, that was something we offered to the model. It did not select it the way that it was configured across any sensitivity or scenario, just was not chosen over the characteristics provided by other resources. So something that obviously we're continuing to seeing to advance that's pretty early on in terms of its market availability and maturity, but there's a lot of folks working on it. We come back to the IRP in a couple of years, we'll run it again and see if it pops up. Hydrogen, there was a conversation around rectangles and squares. Hydrogen's an interesting one, whether you're looking at it as clean or just a general generation resource. There's a lot of hype in the industry about it that seems to come and go. The way that the state set up the law currently, it is not applicable as a clean energy resource. So it would not get us towards anything in that compliance.
No matter which color?
No matter which color. I didn't even want to talk about colors or anything like that because that's 4 more slides probably. So not eligible right now. There's also been incentives that have come and gone in that space. There's different competition among different industries. It's another thing that we are watching, trying to keep an eye on, but did not rise to the top as something to be focused on in the near term. Any questions?
First got to ask Joe if he hit the mark or not.
I don't know.
They're speechless.
We'll defer to the chair.
Joe used to work for me, so I can't make it easy on him. I have I'm going to give you like the 100,000 foot question to any of you that want to answer it. When you look at all this, what do you see as like the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge? What's the one thing on both sides of that coin? Just curious. Clearly, we're in trouble.
I just want to give them a chance to it turns green when you hit the button, it'll turn green. Just give it a second when you hit the button. There you go. There you go.
Challenges, I think, I'm just going to go back to more general. The timing, I think, is going to be a challenge. Just realistically trying to hit 2035, 2040 with some of these technologies. I mean, when we're talking about carbon capture and sequestration, when we're talking about small modular reactors, some of these, I'll say in particular, the clean energy options, we're not there yet. There's kind of an assumption they're going to be available for that timing. And then even with the renewables, with some of the siting challenges, with the MISO queue, with some of these things, I think that's going to be challenging. From an opportunity standpoint, You know, I think there's some unique things there. I really like the idea of leveraging the voluntary green pricing program. You know, I think some of the options it provides, I think the ability to really shape that in a manner that it also provides, I think, a need out there right now for our customers anyway. I think there's a desire out there to have that, some of that optionality available. Makes it easier to satisfy some of the challenges they're facing. So I think that's a real opportunity here.
I think just in general with the integrated resource planning process, we're making a lot of assumptions. We know we're going to be wrong, so the whole point is to try to create multiple different futures and hope you capture it. It's somewhere in the middle. So the challenge is these assumptions change all the time. When we started this, we had one forecast for ourselves, one forecast from LG, one set of incentives at the federal level. Over the course of 6 to 12 months, the deck gets shuffled many, many times, and it's a moving target. So it's great to get a picture and kind of have an idea at a point in time, and then we have to keep adapting over time. So that's the challenge, is to continue to adjust and make sure that we're keeping an eye on this, and that's why we revisit again in 3 or 4 years. Opportunities, it's been really exciting to be part of the process to look at how we make some of these strategies. The computer can only model so many things. We can only ask it to run so many outputs. So there's numbers that are spit out, but then there's interpretations and strategies that you add on top of that, and getting to do that work where you can say, okay, it says this, but can we replace it with A, B, or C and somehow optimize it slightly more? There's more opportunities than are just kicked out by the model.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll start with opportunities first. You know, I think when we look at the strategies that we've identified here, the good news is when you draw that red box around each of those different scenarios, as Joe said, we're going to concentrate on those first 5 years, right? There's a lot of similarity in action plans there. That's really good news. I love that, because that takes away the risk element to it. It gives you confidence to be able to move forward. So that's the greatest opportunity. And our action plans are aligned with that. There's a lot of work to do, because building something maybe a little bit smaller scale but closer to Holland, you know, is really attractive from an availability of the resource to control the actual build of it and operation of it, but also the fact that you could connect it to our system actually avoids transmission costs, which is a big adder, you know, available opportunity for us as well. That's probably what I like about this the most. The challenging part is just the whiplash effect that's going on right now between the dichotomy of the state's aggressive nature in their law with the federal backdrop of not really supporting it at all. And so the fact that we have these ambitious goals but we have no real incentives to help sort of make it happen is the biggest issue from a challenge perspective in my mind.
Thank you. Any other questions, guys?
Yeah. So I guess like one thing maybe just to comment, right? If you look at like 2025, about the only thing that's being installed in 2025 is solar and batteries, right? There's a little bit of natural gas, none of it with carbon capture and sequestration. So that's where we talk about like making assumption as to what resources could be available, and that's maybe it will be. I don't know. But that's something that, like, when all of this stuff is going to be a challenge for sure. For kind of more locally, I guess, with renewables like solar and wind, right? Kind of like you were saying, Dave, the first couple years, build some solar, build some wind. Like, that's the step for all of the possible pathways. But what siting challenges specifically, what time frames, like if you were saying, hey, we want to add 20 megawatts of wind to our portfolio, like what does the process look like? I guess, can you give us some more detail?
So I would say small scale is going to be more of a solar and battery situation than it is going to be a wind situation. As Joe said, we've kind of parked that a little bit because of the siting concerns right now. It really relies upon a much bigger installation to occur for a wind farm.
I guess there hasn't really been wind in Michigan.
Not in a while. No, and they're here. That is a real good statement. I mean, if you look at what was built from a transmission infrastructure standpoint to serve it in the thumb, I think we have maybe 25% of the capacity of the transmission line built out. But there has become a reality, and that is the communities don't want any more in that area. So I mean, we've been firsthand part of that experience with the Pegasus wind farm. Joel kind of had an example of that up there earlier, not necessarily talking specifically in detail about the siting concerns, but that was one that really threw the developers through a bunch of hurdles there that I don't think they felt real good about at the end of the day, and ultimately gives them pause as far as whether or not Michigan has a good climate right now for wind development. It's really challenging. On the solar side, you know, again, there are opportunities, but I think that's a careful conversation too, because we have some opportunities within areas that we actually control, like an old landfill that we operated ourselves as a BPW for years, is in Zeeland Township. But also there's areas that are close enough to our system that aren't necessarily serving retail customers of us. So how do we have that conversation with township officials in those areas where they're going, okay, what's the value proposition for us as we're building something out there that's close enough to the BPW territory, but something that could be potentially impacting, you know, land use in those other areas. So we're just starting in this process, and that's why you say we have a tactical action this year. We actually we plan to have requests for proposals out for battery and solar on a number of different possible installations, from, I would say, very small scale, like less than 5 megawatts in size, to something more like 30 megawatts in size. And again, that helps keep moving forward on things that we can control, but there are going to be challenges associated with those conversations that are around that. When you start getting anything above that 5 megawatt level, you're going to start getting into some land use issues and careful conversations around that.
Dave, when you say 5 megawatts and 30 megawatts, what's that acreage volume?
Yeah, so it's, you can count on, call it around 5 acres or so per megawatt. So you're talking about a 25 acre area for a 5 megawatt. You know, you're talking about 150 acres for a 30 megawatt sort of installation. And so, you know, you start getting up there pretty quickly in terms of the land use needs when you start approaching those kind of levels.
And locally, right, I think this point has been made, but so people listening maybe, locally, right, battery is easier locally. Solar gets a little easier locally, but that circle is getting much larger and obviously not in the city proper. And then wind, it is not even an option in this city or even locally.
Yeah. So I have
At scale.
3 or 4 things here. So just to your comment there, our service area is broader than the city. We provide.
Yes.
Yes.
So this is a regional question, maybe.
It is,
And
yeah.
I think that's something we have to start talking with our neighbors about. I mean, we talked about Zeeland, but there's Holland Township, right?
Yeah, we serve in the 4 surrounding contiguous townships. We have retail customers in all 4 of those townships. Not the
I
entire
understand.
township, but the other piece of it is we have identified potential properties that we control, even that have some acreage availability within areas that might not be City Holland but are still BPW properties. But then we also have some in the City Holland that are, again, smaller acreage areas that we could do some incremental solar on. But to do the 30 megawatt kind of thing, you're talking about that 150 acre, you're starting to get to areas that are pushing the boundaries of our retail area and maybe just beyond that retail area where it's still close enough to directly connect with our system, but aren't in areas that are being served, that we're not serving.
Yeah. Would that be true though with battery?
Not necessarily with battery, no.
Yeah.
Battery is a much smaller footprint.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, we may have some options there to
Absolutely.
work with other communities on battery
Sure.
storage and that kind of thing. Second one, yeah, so I'd be interested to see what that might look like or what those conversations might be like. The second part is ZECs or ZECs, right? I mean, we talked, if you could expand on that, because we said maybe we'd be able to talk about a little bit about the zero emission credits or with the nuclear power, and if there's any way we can look at if this. I don't think this scenario the IRP really looked at
The
those
IRP, when you gave small modular reactor technology to it, to the extent that there was any federal stimulus around nuclear, that was included in the evaluation of it. Just like carbon capture and sequestration, it's called a 45Q. It's a $85 a metric ton of carbon that's actually sequestered underground is an incentive. Oh, it's still coming through here.
Yeah, you are.
Okay. And so those things were made available. I can't recall to what extent an IRA credit or any sort of federal credit around nuclear existed and whether it still exists, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. So if it was, then that was probably given to the model because we would have been qualifying for it as well. But again, it still didn't choose it at this point. Doesn't mean that, again.
Totally agree.
And again, we don't think that would have fit the kind of thing where like, hey, immediately we're going after that anyway, right? It's more in the 2035 to 2040, and it always has been when we looked at our CEP, Strategic Development Team process last time. Things like hydrogen at that time, carbon capture and sequestration, and small modular reactor technology were always strategies that were beyond like 2035 kind of time frame. So I don't doubt that 3-4 years from now when we do the IRA or IRP again, we're going to see some things that are materially different, in that latter part of the period. Good news is that as we look at all the scenarios today, things in that first box look fairly similar, and so it gives us a high level of confidence in terms of what we do right now.
And I think the IRP was done sometime last year, was finished up.
Yeah, we just finished it up actually in the spring. It was adopted in May, so yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, some of those assumptions are being built from even months ahead of that, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things changing. It's changing very quickly.
Very dynamic.
Quickly.
Yeah.
I think, super AI is around the corner, right? Where different technologies and different things are coming around the corner. So I think we always kind of got to be on the edge of that. I guess the question, even for my colleague on the board here, and even the city manager, something we're going to have to potentially consider as a city council is growth. I mean, that's got to be a true, while people want to see growth to some extent, I think we're going to have to really reconsider that as we move forward, because every time we grow, energy becomes a larger demand for us. And so I just want to make sure that we're always looking at not only the future of providing energy, but what the city of Holland will look like.
So again, there's managed growth too, right? And so again, not a lot of people maybe intimately know the structure of the relationship associated with the fairly large growth that we've had through LG, but we've done a lot of work to try to insulate the rest of the community from the risks associated with that concentration. And I think have done a really good job with that, both through the energy law provisions that are here and that contractual relationship that Joel said also had to exist, that acknowledgement that those credits would be provided. But then there's other, I would say, cost volatility risks that are being pushed off to that end-use customer as well. The other thing, and this really kind of goes to the state of Michigan's aggressive program, just to get on a soapbox a little bit, is that there's a very prescriptive program going on with the state level. And yes, it's great to be aggressive in terms of that target, but that's exactly where you want the load to be. If you are actually being a progressive in your decarbonization efforts, the last thing you want is to create a situation where you're pushing them into areas that are more emitting, right? So again, that's one of the flaws, I think, in the state's program is it looks at total carbon reduction rather than intensity of carbon. We should be looking at the intensity of our portfolio and then encouraging growth to happen where the low intensity exists. And similarly here, again, our community energy plan really focuses on intensity of it, not necessarily, hey, we need to cap growth because we can't have any more carbon. It's going to happen somewhere. Why not happen where it's actually being well controlled? So I mean, strategically, that is hopefully a refocus potentially of the energy legislation of the state, because if you want to encourage economic development and have, aggressive programs, you can do both, but to cap it in a way that says you can't be here because we don't want that carbon level to come, it's a global issue.
Yeah.
And so it needs to be thought of that way.
And I'm suggesting that we have to manage, like you said, it's got to be managed. We have to think through it as we grow, what that looks like. We only have so much capacity, and there's a cost to that capacity. And so as we grow, it doesn't matter, that's going to have to be shouldered by someone, and that's going to be the people living here as costs will increase. It just has to be shouldered by the people that are using the system. So we have to be very mindful of that as we go forward as a council, on top of, as we're working on this committee, what we need to do, what is our responsibility. Not saying we have slow growth, I'm just saying we have to be very mindful of it and how we manage it.
Any other questions?
Again, the hope today, and thank you, Joe and Joel. Certainly, any other questions that you have, please. But next time, we have some exploration real quickly around the fact that we have these 5 levers that we identified. And our strategies and tactics and goals are really built around those 5 levers. The first lever being electric portfolio. So it's a quick conversation that are these levers still the right levers? But then we want to really get into the strategies for 2030 that we identified and which ones we've made progress on and which ones we see really being viable to help us get to the targets that we identified and whether those targets need to be revisited at all. You know, that's what our next conversation is. So hopefully the background of what's happened, what hasn't happened in our first session, and then this one in terms of the energy laws, constraints that we have on that, and then the IRP results gives you what you need for us, and the staff will come in with, again, that review of the tactics and strategies that you identified last time and what those goal results are. And it will be kind of this conversation. What we hope to tee up is that you can get through that lever next time. And then the following meeting, then we're getting to 2 more levers and then 2 more levers, and then we're wrapping up, you know, is the goal, you know, in the 6th meeting. So again, that cadence is what we identified, but hopefully we've set the stage now. And if you have any additional comments, questions, you know, in between the meetings too, please let us know so we can come equipped to address that at the next meeting.
All right, thanks. The last agenda item then we have is any other business, which I'm guessing we don't. Looking good. So then I'll take a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Support. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Meeting is over.